tough love. There is no room for the weak in this house. The door slammed so hard the hinges screamed. On the freezing tile floor of my parents' foyer, my 5-year-old daughter was curled into a tight ball next to a carelessly tossed suitcase, her tiny body shivering under a cotton sweater too thin for the dead of winter. I had just returned from an intense medical deployment with the Navy, exhausted, decorated, and desperate for a safe roof over my daughter's head. The reward I received from my own biological parents was our belongings thrown onto the porch, and the deadbolt changed behind us. I had no choice. I drove my shivering child through the frozen streets until we found a homeless shelter that would take us in. We slept on donated cots, surrounded by strangers until exactly 5:45 this morning. A pitch-black armored SUV pulled up to the curb outside the shelter. The door swung open, and Victoria Sterling, my grandmother, chairwoman of a billion-dollar defense conglomerate, stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. She looked at our filthy duffel bags, at Sophia's cracked lips, at the dark circles carved under my eyes. Her jaw locked. She growled, "Maria, why are you and my great-granddaughter here instead of living in the $1 million mansion I personally bought for you?" My ears rang. The sidewalk tilted under my boots. I stammered. What house?" A fury I had never seen before radiated from her body. She pulled out her encrypted phone and made exactly one call. And just 4 days later, in the middle of a lavish high society gala, all the blood drained entirely from my parents' faces. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I stared at the flashing taillights of my grandmother's armored SUV, pulling away from the curb, and the word house echoed through my skull like a bullet ricocheting inside a steel helmet. The sharp winter air dragged my memory backward 8 months to the suffocating scent of expensive lavender perfume that always clung to my mother's clothes. I had just transferred to the local Naval Medical Center, carrying the weight of a grueling overseas deployment on my shoulders and a 5-year-old daughter on my hip. I was exhausted. I was desperate for a brief sanctuary. So, when my mom offered to let us stay at her sprawling estate, I accepted without hesitation. She stood in the grand foyer that first evening draped in designer silk, pouring a glass of vintage red wine with a flawless practiced smile. The exact same smile she plastered on magazine covers for her fake charity foundation, an organization that existed purely to give her access to wealthy donors and political connections, funneling just enough cash to keep auditors happy, while the rest vanished into her personal accounts. She handed me a polished crystal glass, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "It's just temporary. Sophia needs stability and family is always family," she cooed, tilting her head the way she did for newspaper photographers. I looked around the lavish living room at the original oil paintings and the imported marble floors and foolishly believed that blood meant unconditional sanctuary. I began unpacking our battered military duffel bags, carefully organizing Sophia's stuffed animals in the corner of my old childhood bedroom, completely oblivious to the fact that I was walking into a carefully built psychological trap designed to bleed me dry. I swallowed the bitter exhaustion lodged in my throat and forced a grateful smile, wanting desperately to believe my parents had changed. I had spent years searching for their validation, and in that fleeting wine-soaked moment of deceptive hospitality, I convinced myself the war was finally over. I had no idea the true battlefield was waiting right inside those pristine lavender-scented walls. The brutal reality of my new assignment at the Naval Medical Center turned into a relentless 14-hour meat grinder. I spent my days and nights sprinting through chaotic emergency wards, the soles of my combat boots aching on hard linoleum floors. I treated shrapnel wounds, stabilized internal bleeding, held the hands of young Marines who screamed for their mothers in the middle of the night. A fellow corpsman named Davis would silently slide a black coffee onto my station at the start of every shift without being asked. When I pulled a double after a mass casualty drill, he covered my last 2 hours so I could drive back and check on Sophia. That small act of brotherhood, that wordless understanding between two soldiers, was the only genuine kindness I received in any given 24-hour cycle. I would come home long after midnight, my navy uniform reeking of harsh antiseptic bleach and the metallic scent of copper blood. I paid rent on the exact first of every month, a precise sum I calculated from my military pay, after setting aside Sophia's food budget and daycare fees, shrinking myself to take up as little space as humanly possible in their massive house. Yet every single time I walked through the heavy oak door, bone-tired and physically depleted, the psychological bombardment began. I would stand in the kitchen, breathing slow, tactical breaths to suppress the trembling in my hands, trying to pour a simple glass of water. My mom would sit on the plush velvet sofa, casually filing her manicured nails, while sipping imported chamomile tea. She never once asked about my day. She never once asked about the lives I had tried to save. Instead, she would let her piercing gaze slowly scan my wrinkled, blood-spotted uniform, with utter disdain, her upper lip curling almost imperceptibly. She had a gift for finding the weakest spots in my armor and twisting a blade slowly into each one, ensuring I felt completely worthless despite the uniform I wore every day to serve my country. Her absolute lack of empathy felt heavier than the wounded Marines I carried on my back. The tension in the house boiled over on a suffocating Sunday evening. My mom set her delicate porcelain teacup down on the glass coffee table, with a sharp, echoing clink. She crossed her legs, smoothed the silk of her designer lounge set, and looked at me as if I were a stain on her expensive rug. She sneered, her voice laced with venomous superiority. "You are wasting your youth on that system, Maria. Look how pathetic you are." I swallowed the burning insult and tightened my grip on the kitchen countertop until my knuckles turned white, refusing to let her see me bleed. Snorts. Then my dad chimed in. He was a retired logistics officer who masked his endless string of failed business ventures, a bankrupt trucking company, a real estate scam that cost 3 investors their savings, and a series of gambling debts he hid behind locked filing cabinets behind pseudo-military arrogance. He glared at 5-year-old Sophia, who was quietly sitting on the floor coloring a picture in absolute silence. He scoffed loudly, leaning back in his leather recliner, with a look of sickening self-righteousness. "The military has no room for weakness. The girl needs discipline." He said it while pointing a thick finger at a child who had done nothing but exist. They were breaking me down piece by piece, hiding their sociopathic cruelty under the hypocritical guise of strict parental guidance. I stood squarely between them and my daughter, realizing with chilling clarity that this sprawling house was not a home. It was an active psychological war zone. I locked my jaw, staring directly into my dad's cold eyes, silently promising myself I would never let their venom infect the pure mind of my child. The psychological warfare peaked on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. I had just spent 6 agonizing hours saving a young Marine's shattered leg on the operating table, draining every ounce of my physical and mental reserves. I walked through the front door, desperate for a few hours of sleep. My dad stood rigidly at the top of the stairs, arms crossed over his chest like a prison warden. He shoved a typed eviction notice directly into my chest without a single word of warning. 14 days to pack and get out. I did not argue. I did not beg. I folded the paper in half and slid it into my uniform pocket without flinching. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, swallowed my burning tears, and desperately searched for a rental house during the short, chaotic breaks at the Naval Clinic. I sat alone in the sterile hospital break room, in my blood-stained scrubs, frantically scrolling through endless housing listings on my cracked phone screen. One apartment wanted 3 months' rent up front. Another required a credit check that would expose my near-zero savings. A third was in a neighborhood where 2 shootings had been reported that month. My chest tightened as the brutal math revealed itself. My modest military salary simply could not cover the exorbitant security deposits the civilian world demanded. Every snort's single rejection email felt like a countdown timer ticking toward our doom. The walls of my parents' house were closing in, and the streets outside were waiting with open, freezing arms. The clock had not even reached the agreed-upon 14-day mark, but my parents had already rewritten the rules. I drove home through a blinding midnight winter storm, after surviving a brutal back-to-back emergency surgery shift. My hands were numb on the wheel as my battered sedan turned onto their pristine driveway. The property sat eerily quiet. But as my headlights swept across the lawn, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. Right there, under the flickering yellow porch light, my cardboard boxes were stacked on top of one another, carelessly thrown together, half spilling my meager personal possessions, my military medals and Sophia's tiny winter clothes onto the wet, freezing concrete. They had not even bothered to cover our belongings from the pouring sleet. My Purple Heart commendation, still in its velvet case, was sitting in a puddle of ice water next to Sophia's favorite stuffed bear. I slammed the car into park and sprinted through the rain, my combat boots splashing through icy puddles. The reality crushed my lungs as I realized they had intentionally waited for the coldest, most dangerous night of the year to execute their plan, completely disregarding the safety of their own grandchild just to satisfy their twisted craving for absolute control. I dropped my car keys onto the wet concrete and rushed toward the heavy oak porch door. I jammed my key into the lock, but it would not turn. The deadbolt had been changed. I pounded my fists on the solid wood, my knuckles scraping raw and bloody against the frozen surface. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the door cracked open 2 inches. My mom's face appeared in the narrow gap, perfectly moisturized with expensive night cream, her hair styled in silk rollers, her expression utterly devoid of human warmth. She did not look at me with the eyes of a mother. She looked at me like I was a diseased stray animal begging for scraps. She snorts hissed through the gap, her voice slicing the winter air like a frozen blade. Plans have changed. You need to figure out your own life right now. She did not even bother making eye contact. Her cold, calculating eyes were fixed firmly on the dark street behind me, checking to make sure none of her wealthy neighbors were witnessing this display of parental cruelty. Behind her, I could see the living room television flickering, with some late-night talk show, the volume turned low. They had been watching television while their daughter and granddaughter were being locked out into a winter storm. I looked past my mother's designer silk slippers, peering into the brightly lit foyer. And my heart stopped. Sophia was curled up on the icy entryway tiles, wearing nothing but a thin cotton sweater. Her small body trembled from the biting draft clear's throat, sweeping through the cracked door. Her tiny fingers were blue at the tips. She was not crying loudly. She was weeping in total silence, paralyzed by the terrifying adults towering over her, her lower lip quivering so hard I could see it from the porch. From deep inside the warm living room, my dad's voice echoed outward, dripping with sickening arrogance that turned my blood to ice. He barked, never bothering to come to the door and face me. "Just military discipline, Maria. Grow up." He hid behind his wealthy wife and his twisted philosophy, leaving a terrified kindergartner to freeze on the hard floor, while he sat in his heated recliner, with a glass of bourbon in his hand. The heavy wooden door slammed shut in my face. The metal deadbolt clicked with echoing finality, severing every single tie of family loyalty I had ever foolishly believed in. I was locked out in the dead of winter, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect me. The metallic click of that lock sounded like a gunshot, executing the last shred of love I held for them. I did not scream into the night. I did not drop to my knees and beg for a mercy they did not possess. In that moment of absolute abandonment, my military training overrode my shattering heart. I knelt onto the freezing concrete, reached out with trembling hands, and scooped my shivering daughter into my arms. Her small body was so cold, it felt like holding a block of ice wrapped in cotton. I grabbed the heaviest waterlogged box containing our essentials, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my exhausted spine. I backed to my battered sedan in total silence, my jaw locked so tight I thought my teeth would crack. I opened the rear door, gently secured Sophia into her car seat, and wrapped my heavy insulated navy jacket around her trembling shoulders. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and whispered so softly I almost missed it, asking if Grandma was mad at her. I swallowed the razor blade, lodged in my throat, and told her no, that Grandma was just confused, and that we were going on an adventure. I locked all 4 doors, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the struggling engine. cranking the heater to maximum. I stared at the glowing porch light of my childhood home through the rain-streaked windshield, vowing that I would endure any torture necessary to protect my child, and that I would never allow those two monsters to touch our lives again. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, driving us straight into the terrifying abyss of total homelessness. The next few weeks devolved into a relentless urban war for basic survival. I burned through my remaining savings on cheap roach-infested roadside motels, trying to maintain the impossible facade of a normal life for my daughter. When the cash ran dry, my battered sedan became our only permanent home. I parked under dim, flickering streetlights in empty commercial parking lots, always ensuring a clear exit route in case of sudden danger. Every night I wrapped Sophia in my heavy navy jacket, reclining the passenger seat into a makeshift bed. I sat rigidly awake in the driver's seat for hours, watching her tiny breath mist in the unheated air, standing guard against the shadows of the dangerous city. I rationed out cheap canned food, making sure Sophia ate every bite while I survived on black coffee and adrenaline. Some nights the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windshield, and I would start the engine every 45 minutes to run the heater for 10 minutes before killing it again to save gas. My combat boots felt heavier each morning as I stepped into the dawn, stretching cramped muscles and wiping the condensation off my uniform before putting on a brave face for my daughter. At the hospital, I stitched wounds, administered medications, and smiled at my fellow soldiers, completely masking the ruins of my personal life. Davis, the corpsman who always brought me coffee, once caught me washing my face in the hospital bathroom at 4:00 in the morning. He looked at my bloodshot eyes and said nothing. He just left a brown paper bag with 2 sandwiches and an apple on my locker. That is the difference between the family you bleed with and the family that makes you bleed. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a phone call that nearly killed me. Sophia's kindergarten teacher called the Naval Hospital and asked to speak with me in a careful, measured tone that I recognized immediately as the voice of someone delivering bad news. I pressed the plastic phone to my ear, still wearing surgical gloves spotted with a stranger's blood. The teacher told me gently that Sophia was routinely hiding half-eaten stale crackers deep inside her jacket pockets, obsessively hoarding scraps of food during lunchtime, as if she did not know when her next meal would come. Even worse, my daughter was sobbing hysterically, completely inconsolable, whenever any child or adult simply mentioned the word home. The sounds of the operating room faded to nothing. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. My beautiful, innocent daughter was developing severe psychological trauma and hoarding behaviors because of my parents' cruelty. They had not just kicked us out. They were systematically destroying the mental health of a defenseless 5-year-old child. I hung up the phone and pressed my back against the cold tile wall of the hospital corridor. My vision blurred with angry, hot tears that I fiercely refused to let fall. A passing nurse asked if I was all right. I straightened my spine, forced a nod, and walked into the next trauma bay to save another stranger's life while my own daughter's mind was fracturing. My stubborn military endurance was no longer protecting Sophia. It was harming her. I needed to swallow my pride and seek help no matter the cost to my ego. I sat alone in the sterile hospital locker room staring at my military insignia in the smudged mirror. I had survived dangerous combat zones, but I had failed to protect my own flesh and blood from domestic cruelty. My finger had hovered over my grandmother's contact name on my cracked screen 100 times, but my thumb never pressed dial. The reason was a deeply ingrained paralyzing fear. The answer was a deeply ingrained paralyzing fear. Since I was a small child, my manipulative mom had brainwashed me with a terrifying narrative. She told me constantly, with the casual cruelty of a woman trimming roses, that my grandmother despises the weak. She never forgives failures, and she will crush anyone who shows vulnerability. She snorts would sit at the dinner table and tell me stories about business partners Victoria had supposedly destroyed for minor mistakes. She described my grandmother as a cold, heartless machine who only valued perfection. I was terrified that if Victoria saw me living out of a car, she would look at me with disgust or worse, use her billions to strip away my custody of Sophia, deeming me an unfit mother who could not even provide a roof. But hearing about my daughter's food hoarding shattered that hesitation completely. The brainwashing cracked like cheap glass. I had to surrender my pride. I gathered my jacket, grabbed my keys, and drove us to the Homeless Veterans Family Support Center. Every mile I drove toward that shelter felt like an admission of my ultimate failure. The dread of being labeled an unfit mother churned in my empty stomach, threatening to make me pull over and turn back. But one glance at Sophia in the rearview mirror, her tiny fingers wrapped around a stale cracker she had hidden in her coat pocket, hardened my resolve into unbreakable steel. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of the assistance center, holding Sophia's small, trembling hand in mine. She looked around the crowded, chaotic waiting room with wide, frightened eyes. Men in worn army jackets sat slumped against plastic chairs. A woman with 2 toddlers filled out paperwork at the counter, her hands shaking. I knelt snorts down to Sophia's level, gently stroked her hair, and whispered that we were going on a secret military mission to soothe her rising panic. A tired smile flickered across her face, and she nodded bravely, squeezing my hand tighter. The exhausted but kind receptionist looked at my crisp uniform, then at our battered luggage with a look of deep pity that burned my cheeks with shame. She had seen this before. A soldier who saved lives, for a living, standing in a charity line because the people who were supposed to love her had chosen money instead. I picked up the cheap plastic pen attached to the clipboard. My hand shook violently as I filled out the application for emergency housing and food stamps. I was swallowing every ounce of my hard-earned Navy pride, registering myself as a homeless charity case, just to secure a warm bed for my traumatized child. The scratch of the pen on the cheap paper echoed in my ears like a verdict. When I checked the box labeling us as currently living in a vehicle, a single stray tear escaped and dropped onto the form, blurring the blue ink. I wiped it away and locked my emotions back into their vault. I handed the clipboard to the receptionist, explicitly listing Victoria Sterling as our mandatory emergency contact, knowing the shelter system would automatically notify her. It marked the lowest, most humiliating point of my entire existence. The bitter memory of that shelter application faded like smoke, slamming my consciousness back to the freezing concrete sidewalk at 5:45 this morning. The winter wind whipped around us, but my grandmother Victoria stood perfectly still, her imposing figure blocking the icy draft from hitting my shivering daughter. Sophia, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere, nervously tugged on the hem of my wrinkled uniform pants. She looked up at her towering great-grandmother with wide, confused, hopeful eyes. She asked softly, her innocent voice trembling in the quiet dawn, "Mommy, do we have a house?" That single question acted as a detonator. The air around us plummeted to absolute zero. The profound tragedy of a 5-year-old child asking whether she possessed the basic human right of shelter struck Victoria with the force of a physical blow. Her posture stiffened, her shoulders squared like a general preparing for total war. Her manicured fingers curled slowly into a fist at her side. I watched in awe as the billionaire matriarch absorbed the full reality of our situation. She did not gasp. She did not offer empty condolences. The legendary wrath of the Sterling family was ignited by the innocent, shivering voice of my deeply traumatized child, shifting the entire power dynamic of our fractured family in a matter of seconds. Victoria did not offer a hug or utter a single generic apology. Her sharply contoured face hardened into an expression of pure menace, a look that had historically made Wall Street executives cower. She looked at me, her gaze sweeping over my stained uniform, then shifted her eyes toward the depressing facade of the homeless shelter behind us. She did not ask another question. She did not need to. She commanded her voice, slicing through the morning fog like a precisely aimed bullet. "Get in." It was not a grandmotherly request. It was a military directive. I did not hesitate. I grabbed our battered duffel bags and obeyed quickly, buckling a bewildered Sophia into the heated leather seat of the armored SUV. The contrast between the freezing streets we had survived and the insulated fortress of her vehicle was staggering. I slid into the back seat beside my daughter, my heart pounding against my ribs. For the first time in 8 agonizing months, the crushing weight of survival was lifted off my exhausted shoulders. Victoria was not just rescuing us from the cold, she was preparing to wage war against whoever had put us there. The bulletproof doors of the SUV slammed shut, sealing us inside a vacuum of tense, pressurized silence. Victoria did not waste a moment on comfort. She pulled out her secure smartphone and dialed David Vance, her ruthless personal lawyer who handled all her corporate executions. Her tone was calm, completely devoid of sentimentality. She ordered sharply, her words striking like physical blows in the quiet cabin. Immediately check all real estate records at Oakwood Avenue. I want to know who holds the keys, who is living there, and most importantly, which bank account is swallowing the rent money every month. She ended the call with a sharp tap of her manicured finger before David could even confirm. The specific instructions hung heavily in the warm air. She turned slowly, her icy eyes locking onto mine through the rearview mirror. She did not say another word. Her silence communicated everything. She was already piecing together the puzzle, tracking the invisible flow of money that had funded my parents' lifestyle while forcing her great-granddaughter to sleep in a freezing sedan. The corporate titan was hunting for blood. I sat frozen in the plush back seat, my mind racing to process the devastating information. Rent money, Oakwood Avenue. My chest tightened so violently I could not draw a breath. The fragmented, confusing pieces of the last 8 months suddenly locked together in a crystal-clear picture that shattered my entire reality. My parents had not kicked me out to teach me discipline or tough love. They had stolen $1 million house that was meant entirely for me, thrown me onto the freezing street, and pocketed the exorbitant rental cash to fund their fake charity galas and designer clothes. Every fundraiser dinner, every new dress my mother wore, every expensive bottle of wine she uncorked was purchased with money that should have been keeping a roof over my daughter's head. I stared blankly out the tinted window, watching the bleak city streets blur past. The deep, lingering sadness and desperate longing for my parents' affection that I had harbored for years vaporized into pure, concentrated, icy rage. I had spent countless nights crying in my car, blaming myself for failing as a daughter and a mother, while the two people who raised me were bathing in the stolen financial security of their own grandchild. I curled my hands into tight fists on my lap, my Navy training taking over as the truth finally crystallized. I had not been abandoned. I had been robbed by my own bloodline. Every ounce of mercy in my soul evaporated. If you have ever felt the soul-crushing betrayal of discovering your own family plotted against you for money, hit the like button right now. Share your survival story in the comments below, because exposing their lies is how we take our power back. 15 minutes later, the armored SUV pulled into the secured underground parking garage of an exclusive ultra-discreet high-society cafe. Victoria Snorts marched inside with terrifying purpose, ordered a simple black tea, and sat at a secluded mahogany table in a soundproofed VIP corner. Her posture was rigid, her face an unreadable mask of corporate warfare. I sat across from her, keeping a protective arm around Sophia, who was happily eating a warm pastry, completely unaware of the psychological war about to begin. Victoria placed her encrypted smartphone in the exact center of the polished table and tapped the speakerphone button. Without looking at me, she dialed my mother's personal number. My heart hammered against my ribs as the electronic ringing echoed in the quiet room. It rang twice before connecting. The anticipation of hearing my abuser's voice after surviving the hell she had condemned me to made my stomach churn with a toxic mix of anxiety and boiling hatred. Victoria held up a single manicured finger, commanding absolute silence from me. She was setting the stage for a high-stakes interrogation, giving my mother enough rope to hang herself with her own lies. My mom's voice cooed brightly through the speaker. "Dearest mother, what a wonderful surprise. How are you?" It was her signature expertly crafted fake charity gala tone, dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. The exact same melodic, perfectly modulated voice she used to charm wealthy political donors and manipulate naive society reporters. Victoria did not react to the sickeningly fake enthusiasm. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her steaming black tea, maintaining an expression of absolute neutrality. She asked casually, her voice devoid of suspicion, while her sharp eyes locked dead onto mine across the table. "How is Maria doing? I haven't seen her in a while." The audacity of the setup was breathtaking. Victoria was playing the role of the distant, uninformed matriarch, offering my mother the golden opportunity to confess or double down on her deception. I sat paralyzed, my teeth grinding so hard my jaw ached. Hours ago, I had been freezing in a homeless shelter, terrified that Sophia would suffer permanent damage from the cold. Now, I was being forced to listen to the very architect of my suffering masquerade as a loving, devoted daughter to the grandmother she was actively defrauding. The psychological whiplash tested the absolute limits of my military discipline. I clenched my fists under the table so hard my forearms ached. Without a microsecond of hesitation or the slightest tremor of guilt, my mom spun a flawless web of lies. "Maria is doing wonderfully at Oakwood Avenue, Mother. She absolutely loves the house. You know her. She's highly independent and doesn't want to bother you, but everything is perfect." My blood turned to boiling acid. I stared at the glowing phone screen, my fingernails digging so deeply into my palms that warm blood pooled against my skin, dripping silently onto the mahogany table. The evil required to speak those joyful words, while knowing her 5-year-old granddaughter had been starving in a frozen car, was beyond human comprehension. She was painting a fictional masterpiece of my life, using stolen rent money to fund her delusions, while I had begged for government food stamps to keep Sophia alive. My chest heaved with suppressed rage, every muscle in my combat-trained body screaming at me to snatch the phone and shout the truth into the speaker. But I remained silent, honoring Victoria's command. Enduring the excruciating torture of listening to the monster who destroyed my life brag about my fabricated happiness to protect her stolen wealth, I focused on my bleeding hands to ground the erupting anger. The pain in my palms was nothing compared to the pain of hearing my own mother sell a beautiful fairy tale, while her granddaughter learned to hoard crackers in her coat. She was irredeemable. I knew I could never forgive her. The woman, cheerfully speaking those honeyed words, was the same monster who had tossed a terrified 5-year-old onto freezing concrete without a second thought. Victoria's face remained an impenetrable fortress of stone as she reached out and tapped the red button, cutting the call dead without a word of goodbye. She did not flinch at the tiny drops of fresh blood pooling from my clenched fists onto her immaculate table. She leaned forward slowly, folding her hands together, her piercing gaze slicing through my remaining defenses. She stated, her voice dropping to a register that promised total destruction. God snorts, "Your mother is not mistaken. She is lying through her teeth, and that confirms all my suspicions." She was not just angry. She was calculating the exact trajectory of her impending airstrike against her own daughter. I grabbed a thick linen napkin from the table and wiped the smeared blood from my stinging palms, my scattered focus snapping fully into place. The paralyzing spell of desperate, unrequited familial love that had bound me for 28 years was permanently shattered in that quiet cafe. I looked at my grandmother, my own eyes hardening to match her icy resolve. We were no longer family members navigating a misunderstanding. We were two generals preparing to annihilate a common enemy. The coming war would be fought with financial records, legal maneuvers, and the devastating unvarnished public truth. 4 days before my parents' highly publicized Garcia Family Charity Gala, Victoria initiated the first phase of her counterstrike. She relocated Sophia and me from the homeless shelter directly into a sprawling, secure royal suite at the city's most exclusive 5-star hotel. The massive penthouse, with its sweeping panoramic views of the glittering skyline, served as our tactical command center. Victoria sat at the head of the polished dining table, while David Vance, her intensely focused personal lawyer, methodically laid out thick, heavily redacted financial dossiers across the glass surface. The atmosphere crackled with dangerous suppressed energy. Victoria declared, her voice heavy with lethal, unforgiving intent that sent a shiver down my spine. "I was wrong to trust them, but I will fix this mistake, right?" She reached across the table and handed me a thick manila folder, packed with undeniable evidence of their treason. The days of me crying in a freezing car paralyzed by fear and shame were officially over. Under Victoria's commanding presence, I was transforming from a helpless victim into a heavily armed executioner. I opened the folder, my military training kicking in as I prepared to analyze the enemy's movements and absorb the exact dimensions of my parents' betrayal. I traced my fingers over the thick stack of legally binding documents, realizing that every single page represented a lie my parents had told to the world. The sheer volume of their organized deceit was staggering, proving that their cruelty was not a sudden mistake, but a coldly calculated financial operation designed to strip away my future. David Vance stood up, adjusted his expensive tie, and began walking me through the damning files like a military intelligence officer debriefing a commander. The Oakwood Avenue house was a magnificent $1 million welcome home gift that Victoria had secretly purchased outright for me, handing the master keys and deed to my parents to prepare the property for my return from deployment. Instead of welcoming me, they buried the property paperwork, forged my signature on multiple legal documents, and leased the massive property to a wealthy, oblivious tech executive for nearly $8,000 a month. They then siphoned every dime of the exorbitant rent directly into their offshore accounts to fund their hollow lifestyle and cover my dad's massive hidden gambling debts. I flipped through the highlighted bank statements, my breathing slow, tactical, and entirely detached from the emotional horror of what I was reading. I traced the specific documented dates where massive deposits hit their accounts. October 14th. That was the night I slept in a gas station parking lot because the motel had no vacancies. November 2nd. That was the morning Sophia's teacher called about the food hoarding. December 10th. That was the night they changed the locks. Those exact same dates, massive rent payments were flowing into their accounts while I was begging for cheap motel rooms and rationing stale crackers for my traumatized daughter. The magnitude of their greed was sickening. They had monetized my homelessness, turning my suffering into their personal ATM. I closed the heavy file with a sharp echoing snap. My jaw locked so tightly it ached. I did not shed a single tear. My heart had calcified into stone, leaving no room for anything except a burning desire for total retribution. I looked up at David, my eyes devoid of any remaining warmth, and gave him a single sharp nod. I understood the mission. The enemy had overplayed their hand, leaving a massive paper trail of their own destruction. With the financial autopsy concluded, Victoria reached into her designer blazer and slid a heavy, solid platinum credit card across the glass table. It stopped right in front of my hands. She gave me a direct, non-negotiable order to leave the hotel and purchase a bespoke tailored suit for the upcoming gala. Instinctively, I reached for my neatly folded navy dress blues resting on the nearby armchair. I wanted to hide behind the honorable medals and the protective armor of the military institution I had served faithfully. But Victoria moved with astonishing speed, her hand shooting out to stop my arm in midair. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her eyes burning with an intense fire. She instructed firmly, her voice leaving no room for debate. "You don't need to wear a uniform to prove your strength to them. You just need your dignity. Walk in there like a queen reclaiming her crown. Nick." Her words struck deep, shattering the last remnants of my childhood insecurity. I slowly pulled my hand away from my uniform, realizing she was right. Hiding behind the navy was a defensive maneuver. Walking into that ballroom as Maria Garcia, a self-made, resilient woman, was an offensive strike that would cut far deeper. I picked up the heavy platinum card, the cool metal grounding my racing thoughts, and gave my grandmother a sharp nod of compliance. I silently accepted the monumental responsibility of destroying my parents' fake empire with my own two hands. Later that evening, after a grueling fitting session at the city's most exclusive boutique, I stood before the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master bedroom of the royal suite. The reflection staring back at me was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the wrinkled, desperate layers of a terrified homeless mother, begging for government scraps. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray designer suit that fit my athletic frame with lethal precision. My posture was military straight shoulders, pulled back jaw set like carved granite. I stared into my own dark eyes and realized I was not an abandoned, unloved daughter, craving my parents' toxic affection anymore. The agonizing trials of the past 8 months had burned away all my civilian vulnerabilities, forging me into an unbreakable weapon of willpower. I was a trained combat medic, preparing to walk directly into a heavily populated enemy strike zone, armed with the undeniable truth and the financial backing of a ruthless billionaire. I checked my crisp cuffs, ensuring every detail was flawlessly executed. The upcoming gala was not a party. It was the execution chamber for Elena and Richard Garcia. I took one final deep tactical breath, fully embracing the icy persona I needed to adopt. The heavy chains of their lifelong manipulation were permanently severed, leaving me free to strike without hesitation. I turned away from the mirror, my polished shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, marching toward the final battle of my life. The Garcia family charity gala was in full extravagant swing at the center of the city's most opulent hotel ballroom. A sickening display of stolen wealth funded entirely by the millions they had siphoned from the property meant for my innocent daughter. Victoria had already arrived through a discreet private entrance and secured Sophia in a heavily guarded VIP suite upstairs, surrounded by her favorite snacks and 4 armed security contractors. Knowing my daughter was safe and entirely out of the crossfire gave me the unshakable peace of mind I needed to execute my mission. I stood alone in the dimly lit hallway outside the massive carved double doors of the grand hall. I adjusted the crisp cuffs of my tailored suit one final time, feeling the heavy fabric settling against my shoulders like a suit of modern armor. The faint, muffled sounds of a live classical string quartet drifted through the heavy wood, punctuated by the obnoxious echoing laughter of oblivious high society elites. I closed my eyes for a single second, took one deep tactical breath to center my racing heart, and locked away every last ounce of lingering civilian anxiety. I was not just a daughter crashing her parents' party. I was the harbinger of their destruction. I placed both hands flat against the polished brass handles, preparing to breach the fortified enemy perimeter. The time for hiding was over. It was time to pull the trigger. I shoved the heavy mahogany doors wide open with enough force that they slammed against the interior walls, instantly commanding the attention of every person in the glittering room. The upbeat classical music seemed to choke on its own notes. The booming laughter of the wealthy crowd died, instantly replaced by a suffocating silence. I walked directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not rush my steps. I did not lower my gaze to the polished floor, like the submissive, broken daughter they expected me to be. My dark eyes locked immediately onto the center of the crowded room. My mom, draped in an expensive, glittering, jewel-toned couture gown, purchased with my stolen rent money, froze mid-law. The crystal wine glass in her manicured hand tilted dangerously, threatening to spill dark red liquid all over her carefully curated facade. Her camera-ready smile fractured, replaced by a look of sheer terror as she recognized the powerful woman standing at the entrance. I did not break eye contact for a single second. I let her fully absorb the devastating reality that the exhausted, homeless, broken medical corpsman she had thrown onto the freezing street had returned. And I had not returned to beg for her toxic scraps of affection. I had returned with the singular purpose of burning her stolen empire to the ground. The entire ballroom held its breath. She was trapped. My dad was standing right beside her, loudly bragging about his fictitious military logistics experience to a wealthy, oblivious state senator. He noticed the terrifying silence spreading through the ballroom and slowly turned around. The second his eyes landed on my tailored, imposing figure, every drop of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. The arrogant pseudo-military bravado he always wore like a cheap costume evaporated into thin air. I began to march forward, cutting a straight, unyielding path directly through the parting sea of wealthy socialites. My polished leather heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the pristine marble floor, echoing through the dead, silent room with the terrifying cadence of a military drum preparing for an execution. I did not scream at them. I did not shed a single tear. I stared at both of them with eyes that felt like frozen abysses, completely devoid of any remaining empathy or familial warmth. The psychological pressure I was radiating was more devastating than any physical weapon. I was forcing them to stand paralyzed in the blinding spotlight of their own gala, unable to escape the approaching consequence of their greed. Every step I took toward them crushed another piece of the fragile lie they had spent 8 months constructing. The wealthy guests nervously whispered among themselves, sensing the imminent destruction of the Garcia family's carefully crafted public image. I was a predator cornering my prey. The invisible pressure in the ballroom became suffocating. I stood still watching with intense detached satisfaction as a thick bead of cold sweat broke out on my dad's forehead, trailing slowly down his pale temple. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, like a suffocating fish, completely unable to formulate a single coherent excuse. My mom's manicured hand shook so violently that the dark red wine finally sloshed over the rim of her crystal glass, permanently staining the pristine white tablecloth and completely ruining her perfect presentation. I halted exactly 10 feet from them, standing at rigid military attention. I blocked both of them in a silent, inescapable crosshairs, paralyzing them with the sheer force of my unyielding presence before the hammer even officially fell. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, unable to run, unable to hide, unable to deploy their usual gaslighting tactics in front of 300 elite witnesses. The terrifying silence stretched on an agonizing psychological torture, designed to break their spirits before Victoria even entered the room. I did not need to speak a single word to dominate the battlefield. My silent, imposing existence was a devastating declaration of total war. I watched their arrogant facade crumble to dust, savoring every second of their well-deserved terror. They knew it was over. The trap had snapped shut. The suffocating tension snapped violently as the massive main doors of the ballroom slammed open once again, hitting the walls with a deafening crash. Victoria Sterling, the undisputed matriarch of the billion-dollar conglomerate, marched into the room tightly flanked by her ruthless personal lawyer, David Vance. She snorts did not look like a frail grandmother. She looked like an angry deity descending to deliver judgment upon the wicked. Without uttering a single word of greeting to the horrified whispering crowd, David moved with practiced clear-throat efficiency. He pushed past a stunned waiter, plugging his secured laptop directly into the ballroom's massive LED presentation screen that had been set up for their fake charity auction. The screen flickered to life, and the first classified slide illuminated the entire dark room with blinding, undeniable truth. It was the official legally binding deed to the sprawling Oakwood Avenue property, clearly and permanently registered in my full name, Maria Garcia. The physical proof of Victoria's generosity and my parents' theft was magnified to 20 feet tall for every single one of their wealthy friends, political allies, and business partners to witness. The carefully constructed illusion that my parents were generous, wealthy philanthropists shattered in an instant. They were nothing more than common thieves who had stolen from their own traumatized child, and Victoria was exposing their crimes to the entire world. The curated atmosphere of the gala dissolved into a chaotic courtroom, with Victoria serving as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. A loud collective gasp of shock ripped through the elite crowd as David Vance clicked to the next slide. It displayed a highly illegal fraudulent lease agreement containing my completely forged signature, officially notarized by my own mother. Then David delivered the lethal blow. Heavily highlighted bank statements proving that tens of thousands of dollars in stolen rent money had been flowing directly into my parents' offshore accounts for the past 8 months. The timeline of their sudden wealth correlated perfectly with the darkest period of my homeless survival. My dad, sensing the total destruction of his social standing and financial future, panicked completely. He lunged toward the front of the stage, screaming frantically at the whispering crowd. Snorts, this is defamation. This is an internal family matter. You can't just project private documents. His voice cracked, entirely devoid of the pseudo-military discipline he constantly preached. He reached out desperately to unplug the laptop, But David Vance stepped smoothly in front of him, blocking his path with the terrifying confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. The desperate flailing actions of my dad only confirmed his absolute guilt to the horrified audience. He was not a strong, disciplined patriarch. He was a terrified con artist cornered by a much larger, far more dangerous predator, incapable of defending his unforgivable actions. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the fake philanthropist was brutally unmasked as a desperate, thieving coward. Realizing that their lucrative scam was permanently destroyed, my mom collapsed heavily to her knees, her expensive tailored designer dress pooling around her on the cold marble floor. She abandoned her arrogant, high society persona, completely sobbing desperate, real tears as she tried to salvage the unsalvageable. She snorts wailed, her voice echoing shrilly through the dead silent ballroom. "Mother, please. I just borrowed the money temporarily to pay off Richard's massive business debts. I swear on my life I will pay every single dime back." Victoria stood perfectly still, staring down at her own weeping daughter with a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust that chilled the entire room. She did not offer a shred of maternal sympathy. She stated loudly, her voice booming with undeniable, terrifying authority. "You threw a 5-year-old child out onto the street in the dead of winter to profit from my trust. From this minute, all inheritance rights and financial aid will be permanently severed. My conglomerate will destroy anyone who dares to do business with you." The finality of Victoria's decree echoed like a massive gavel slamming down. My mom let out a horrifying guttural scream of pure despair, finally realizing she had not just lost the stolen house. She had lost her entire fake empire, her wealthy friends, and her future in one catastrophic stroke. The ruthless billionaire had officially executed her own daughter, permanently banishing her to a life of utter ruin and social exile. With the destruction of their standing complete, David Vance calmly stepped forward, unceremoniously dropping a thick, heavy stack of federal fraud subpoenas directly onto my dad's trembling chest. The legal documents outlined the severe impending criminal charges for grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. I stepped out of the shadows and walked right up to my trembling, weeping mother, still collapsed on the marble floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or lingering affection as I looked down into her completely ruined, tear-streaked face. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice was cold, controlled, and loud enough for only her to truly hear the devastating impact of my final words. I stated firmly, delivering the ultimate psychological kill shot with the precision of a trained sniper. "You should have remembered family bonds before turning your granddaughter's home into a gold mine." My words paralyzed her completely, silencing her desperate sobbing. I did not wait for another manipulative excuse or a fake apology. I turned on my polished heel and walked smoothly out of the opulent ballroom, flanked tightly by Victoria and David. I never once looked back at the smoking ruins of the toxic family I had finally escaped. The heavy mahogany doors closed softly behind us, officially marking the end of my nightmare and the undisputed beginning of my total liberation. I had survived their brutal psychological war, reclaimed my stolen dignity, and destroyed the monsters who had tried to bury me. I was finally free. 8 months after the catastrophic events of that gala, the storm had finally settled. I stood in the sun-drenched, beautifully renovated kitchen of my sprawling Oakwood Avenue home, brewing a fresh pot of expensive dark roast coffee. The rich, dark aroma filled the bright room, mixing with the clean smell of lemon wood polish on the countertops. The contrast between my current reality and the nightmare of sleeping in a freezing sedan was staggering. I had continued my dedicated medical service in the Navy, studying late into the night, and currently preparing to take my officer commissioning exams next month. The massive house no longer felt like a stolen asset or a painful reminder of my parents' cruelty. It felt like a fortified, loving sanctuary, entirely free of the toxic fear and manipulation that had plagued my past. The large open windows let in the bright morning sunlight, warming the hardwood floors where Sophia liked to sit and draw. I had rebuilt my entire life from the ground up, transforming from a desperate homeless victim into a focused, successful military professional. The hard-earned stability I now possessed was a direct result of my own resilience and the uncompromising boundaries I had finally learned to enforce. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the profound freedom that came with, knowing I would never again beg for the love of people who were incapable of giving it. My grandmother Victoria visited our home every single Sunday without fail. She would leave her terrifying corporate persona at the front door, kick off her designer heels, and sit cross-legged on the living room floor to drink imaginary tea and play quietly with her beloved great-granddaughter. She had a stuffed bear named General Fuzzy that she saluted every time she arrived. Sophia would giggle so hard she would fall over. Meanwhile, the devastating reality of my parents' new life had plunged them into inescapable ruin. Stripped of Victoria's massive financial backing and terrified by the impending federal fraud charges, their creditors had swarmed them like vultures. They were rapidly bankrupted. Their luxury cars were repossessed from the driveway in broad daylight while the neighbors watched. Their sprawling estate was officially foreclosed upon by the banks. Furthermore, they were permanently blacklisted by the elite high society circles they had worshipped their entire lives. Nobody wanted to be associated with the monsters who had thrown a defenseless child into the freezing winter. The last I heard through David Vance's legal updates, they were renting a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the south side of town, and my dad had been denied 3 job applications because of the pending fraud charges. The stark contrast between my bright, peaceful future and their entirely self-inflicted misery was the ultimate proof that karma had been executed. They had gambled everything on their greed and lost it all. I felt zero guilt for their downfall. They were reaping exactly what they had sown. They were erased from my reality. My cell phone suddenly vibrated on the cool marble kitchen counter, shattering the peaceful morning silence. An unknown, unlisted number flashed on the glowing screen. I did not need caller ID. I knew exactly who it was. The desperate begging calls had started exactly 1 month ago. Endless weeping voicemails from my mom, asking for forgiveness, and more importantly, begging for financial mercy. They were completely broke and terrified of the impending federal prison sentences looming over their heads. 8 months ago, the sound of her crying voice would have triggered a massive panic attack and a desperate urge to save her. I would have emptied my bank account. I would have driven across town in the middle of the night. I would have swallowed every insult and crawled back into their trap, because I was still that little girl begging for her mother's love. But today I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or familial obligation. I reached out, tapped the glowing screen, blocked the unknown number without listening to a single second of the voicemail, and permanently deleted the call log without a second thought. The ironclad boundary I had constructed around my new life was entirely impenetrable. I refused to let even a single drop of their toxic venom infect the sanctuary I had built for my daughter. Blocking that number was not just a dismissive action. It was a profound declaration of my absolute independence from their lifelong psychological abuse. I was the commander of my own destiny, and they were permanently exiled. I picked up my warm ceramic mug of coffee and walked slowly toward the living room, leaning casually against the wooden doorframe. I stood in the quiet warmth, watching Sophia sitting happily on the soft plush rug, coloring a bright, colorful picture with a massive box of new crayons. She had drawn a yellow house with a red door, a big tree, and 2 stick figures holding hands. She was not hoarding stale crackers in her tiny pockets anymore. She was not terrified of the word home anymore. The invisible war that had nearly destroyed us was permanently over. I had learned the most difficult lesson about toxic bloodlines and generational trauma. True military discipline is not about silently enduring unimaginable abuse from your family. It is about having the courage to cut the deadly infection out of your life entirely, no matter how much it bleeds. I smiled softly, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my hot coffee, feeling completely at peace with the brutal choices I had made. I had reclaimed my stolen dignity, protected my innocent child, and destroyed the monsters who had tried to bury us in the freezing dark. The shadows of my painful past were permanently erased by the bright dawn of my future. I was finally irrevocably free to live my life on my own terms. The battle was over, and I had emerged as the victor. We were finally safe. Walking away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace is the bravest decision you can ever make. If my story of cutting ties and fighting back inspired you, please snorts leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you have ever had to enforce an iron boundary against toxic family members.